We're officially going to start our program. And I'm going to introduce Laura Adams, our wonderful colleague from Summer Sessions and Study Abroad. It's so important for us to know who's in our classroom and how they're arriving into our classroom. And Laura has done an incredible job of mining the information on demographic breakdown of our summer enrollment students. So Laura, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen. Once again, my name is Laura Adams. I am a project and policy analyst with the Summer Sessions and Study Abroad unit. I'm really happy to be here today. My email address is down here at the bottom. If you have any questions that we don't get to, please feel free to reach out. Okay, so to just as some background context in terms of what's going to impact the enrollment in your classes, it's important to be aware of some of our summer 2021 policies that are different than a traditional summer. So these are continuations actually from relaxed policies from 2020, where we were really trying to attract interest in this remote enrollment. So to do that, we went ahead and waived the $100 cancellation fee that's typically assessed when a summer student enrolls and then drops to 0 units. So there's really no penalty for signing up and giving it a try. Additionally, refund penalties were relaxed. So a student can drop up to the second Friday of instruction with a full refund, including that $380 campus fee, which is typically non-refundable in a normal summer. For the 3-week sessions, that's 1 week into instruction. After the refund deadline, if a student drops, they can still apply a tuition credit if they enroll in a course after the drop within the same summer term. Another policy that was relaxed was the deadline to change grading option. This was again from summer 2020, and it's going to remain for summer 2021. And a student can change their grading option up until the last week, 1 week before the end of the summer session that they're enrolled in. And then finally, again, from summer 2020, we're waiving the $400 international service fee, because that's typically assessed for issuing an I-20 for a student to actually apply for a visa to come to the US. So what we're looking at so far in terms of summer 2021 is we really have to compare it to summer 2020, where we saw this absolutely tremendously huge increase in UCB undergraduate enrollment. And this was seen across the system. Every UC had an absolutely record year in terms of undergraduate enrollment in summer sessions. So currently we're actually trending down from that in terms of comparing this week of enrollment to where we were a year ago. We're down about 15% in terms of the UC undergraduate headcount, but we're probably still going to end up ahead of where we would be in a traditional summer with UC students on campus. Last summer and this summer, we saw a decline in visitors, particularly in the form of international students. What we've learned about the summer population is that for international students, an in-person experience is really fundamental to them in terms of their enrollment. However, we are seeing some return of international enrollment. It's just simply not what it is in a traditional summer. We saw huge growth in 2 programs called the pre-college program, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment, and what we call the summer edge programs. So these were populations that really benefited from remote enrollment. It became more accessible for these students and more affordable to participate. Last summer, all study abroad programs were canceled. They're back this summer, however, they're all virtual. So we're piloting experiences like virtual global internships, as well as some traditional study abroad, but in a virtual format. So the numbers are small, but there's some students willing to give that a try. And then overall, we're looking at pretty similar demographics from overall summers in terms of the students who are enrolled. So we'll just dive right in to the numbers. So what we're looking at here is sort of the breakdown of enrollment from 2017 on the far right here up to 2021 as of this most recent snapshot. And what you can really see here is how these remote summers changed the breakdown of students. So you see this huge jump right last summer in the number of matriculated UCB undergraduates that are enrolled, like 15,000. It's just absolutely phenomenal. And in terms of like the overall breakdown, you know, it really was the majority of students in classes at the undergraduate level were these students. So, you know, we've lost our study abroad population, and then our visiting population is much smaller. So these numbers will continue to grow, but we are at the point in the summer where we're starting to flatten out a little bit in terms of enrollment. So we'll see at this point last year, we were about 80% of final for UCB undergraduate. So we won't hit that really high number probably this year, but it's still going to be more than a traditional summer. So moving on to look at the ethnicity of students, this is what we call level 1 ethnicity. It's a single value ethnicity. So it's really the highest umbrella level that the campus looks at. And here on the far left, you've got the 2021 academic year. So looking at the census from the fall and the spring terms and averaging those, what our population looked like. So this dark blue is Asian. The yellow here is international students, who of course do have an ethnicity as well, but in this view, they're separated out as international students. The light blue is underrepresented minority, which at Berkeley includes African American, Chicano Latino, Pacific Islander, and then Native American and Native Alaskan. And then at the top here, you've got white other, which also includes the declined to state students. So really what you see is that in terms of summer ethnicity compared to academic year, it really follows a pretty similar pattern for those UCB undergraduates. What we do see is slightly higher international student enrollment. So when we say international student here, we're talking about fully matriculated 4-year degree students that are international students. So they're Berkeley undergraduates. And the reason why we see higher enrollment of those students in summer is because there's no non-resident tuition in summer. So it's really affordable, much more affordable for international students to pick up some of those extra classes in summertime. So moving on, looking at gender, again, on the far left here, we're looking at this most recent academic year, our censuses skewing heavier towards female. We see an even heavier skew in summer towards female, although it's, roughly it's still in the same range as the academic year. But right now for summer 21, it's 57% female. So moving on, there's a lot going on in this slide, apologies for that. But we're gonna start up here on this entry status slide. I think I see a flash, okay. So entry status, when we talk about entry status, we're talking about students who enter as freshmen for a 4-year degree or students who enter as transfer students. So they've done some time at community college and they've transferred in to complete their degree at UC Berkeley. So at the top here, it's roughly 80% students who are doing a 4-year degree and 20% students who are transfer students during the academic year. And we do skew a little heavier in summer towards transfer student enrollment, which is really great. And it really sort of logically makes sense. These students have less time to complete their degree. And additionally, there's really a lot of enrichment opportunities in summer to take advantage of, like summer only minors and study abroad, internship opportunities, picking up a second major. There's really a lot for transfer students to take advantage of in summertime. I think if there's, I'm not, apologies, I'm not watching the chat. So if there's questions, you can let me know in a little bit. Okay, so then in terms of like who these UCB undergraduates are, most of them are continuing on. So they're students who have already experienced remote teaching in the last academic year, and they're coming on. They're continuing on for summer enrollment. So in summer 2020, for instance, 83% of the undergraduates were continuing on from the prior spring. That number was actually lower for summer 20 than in a traditional summer. Usually it's about 90%. But the other students who aren't the continuing on are returning students. So those are students who have taken a break from UC Berkeley and they've been readmitted and they're choosing to start with summer before they launch back into fall. That's typically 1% to 2% of the enrollment for undergraduate UCB. And then our new students, and this is what has really changed in the last year in a very exciting way. And that's these fall 2021 admits who are choosing to matriculate in the summer term, get their feet wet, take their first Berkeley course before they officially begin their academic career in the fall. And we do that through these programs called Freshman Edge and Transfer Edge, and they have additional enrichment opportunities and workshops to help them acclimate to campus. So, in a traditional summer, these students had to actually physically come to campus, and especially with freshmen, maybe their parents aren't quite ready to let them come to campus, and it's also tremendously expensive to get housing in summer for these programs. So we saw a huge increase in population and participation for these two groups, and it grew up to, I actually can't see it through the closed captioning, but about 1,300 students. So, and that was about 9% of the overall undergraduates for these brand new students coming. So just sort of keeping in mind that there's a lot of students that are in these classes that this is really their first Berkeley course. Okay, moving on, looking at first generation status. So the way that we typically look at first generation status is through the statistic that comes from their original UC application when they applied to UC Berkeley to become admitted. They're asked questions about their family education history. So these are students who indicated that neither of their parents have a four-year degree. So that's typically the way that we define first-generation status at Berkeley. So looking at the admission years over about a four-year period, there's about 30% of students who actually accept their admission to Berkeley have indicated that neither of their parents have a four-year degree. We tend to trend just a tiny bit higher in summer on that statistic, but it really depends on the summer. So last summer with such high enrollment, it kind of came down to the average, but in the prior summers, we were around 32, 33% for first generation. Looking at class standing. So this is the one thing that will change a little bit before the start of summer or during summer compared to those other statistics. The numbers will grow, but the overall percentages will probably stay the same. But here, this is where we'll see that growth in freshman enrollment. And the reason why it's so low right now is that freshmen have just had to commit on May 1st to coming to Berkeley. So they're still making that decision about whether or not they want to enroll in summer. So we'll see that grow. And that's where right here, you see this huge growth in summer 2020 at up to 11%, right, of these freshmen like diving in and taking their first course. And there's additional financial incentives, like there's certain courses that we waive the tuition for this population as well. So, but overall in summer session, we do see heavier participation in sort of the upper class. So lots of seniors, which again makes sense. They're taking final degree requirements. They're participating in enrichment opportunities like study abroad and other things. And additionally, you might have students who this is their last class at UCB as opposed to their first class. So last summer, 7% of the students who participated in summer were actually graduating that summer on the summer degree list. Okay, so just really quickly, just touch on a few other populations to be aware of in your classes. There are student parents who participate in summer. It's actually a really difficult metric to get at. I typically look at the number of undergraduates who receive student parent grants. So that's averaged around 130 undergraduates for the last 4 summers who've received a student parent grant. Students with disabilities, again, that's a difficult metric to get, but we know that more than 3,500 UC Berkeley students take advantage of services offered by the Disabled Students Program during the academic year. So visitors also who need accommodations in classes come through our own DSP program. So you will be working with students to present letters from the DSP office for accommodations in the courses. And then high school students. So again, this is another big growth area here. We do have a pre-college program. There is a residential version of this in a traditional summer that hasn't run for the past 2 summers. And so we opened up this virtual program, and with this massive expansion in the number of courses available, we've seen massive interest from high school students. Again, it's much more accessible. They don't have to pay as much because they're living at home. So far we've had over 800 applicants, and right now about 470 are enrolled. Last summer it was over 600 by the end, and I'm guessing we'll exceed that this summer. So a really big chunk of those visitors are actually high school students, and in a lot of cases taking their first college class, although there's a lot of really superstar students in this group, so maybe it isn't. Those students are over the age of 16, and they're rising juniors and seniors. And if you're curious, they actually perform really, really quite well in the courses. Okay, and then lastly, I just wanted to touch on financial need of our students. Generally speaking, UC Berkeley has a high financial need population. During the academic year, 52% of our undergraduates receive some kind of gift aid. That means that through their FAFSA, it's been determined that they have need high enough to receive some kind of grant in addition to loan. In summer, we see that trend continuing, although a little bit lower. So for the last 4 summers, an average of 43% of our UCB undergraduates received a UC summer fee grant. So again, that means that their financial need was high enough in that prior academic year to get some kind of gift aid. So if you're curious about how much money is available for these students, like at the highest level of need, which is our Pell students, this grant will cover up to 6 units and the $380 campus fee, and then additionally on top of that, a Pell grant. In summer 2020, 52% of the undergraduates enrolled received a UC-based award, and 28% received some kind of federal award for summer. So again, high financial need, but we are seeing, again, there's some gains with remote enrollment in some cases in terms of making summer more accessible. So that's the end of my official presentation. I lost track of my chat window. Let me try to find it here.
So, hi, Laura, thank you so much. There's a quick question that actually came in right at the beginning on the data available outside of the binary categories of male and female. Yes. And I'm just wondering if you can talk to what Cal Answers provides us with.
Yes, it's quite frustrating. So the data exists. It's just simply not in the data warehouse. Like, it's starting to change. Like, for instance, right now there are 9 students in this population that showed up as non-binary, which we know, of course, the actual number is higher. So students are actually asked quite robust gender identity questions on the UC application, but what's coming, this data is mostly coming from the SIS system, which had a really locked binary system for gender. So what we haven't seen is that this data that exists isn't translating into our data warehouse yet. So it's out there in terms of the numbers that we're looking at. Students do have the ability to, it began with their UC application, and then within their Cal Central account, they can adjust their gender identity there. But again, I need to check in with the Office of Planning and Analysis and see when we're going to see some significant change in that. But it is a really frustrating that we can't get really accurate statistics. But those ones that you're looking at, the students did at least have the opportunity to go in and adjust to either decline to state. Now they can adjust to non-binary, but again, students don't necessarily go poking around in their profile to change. So what we really need is the data to start good, start really strong, and then carry over.
Yeah, thank you for that, Laura. And I'll find the link actually to the gender description categories and put it in chat. You have to dig for it, which itself says something, and I'll put it in chat when I have it. There's another question in chat, Laura. A student asked if more financial aid is granted for a full-time student versus part-time student.
That would be the case for an actual Pell Grant. So to qualify for financial aid, you have to take 6 units. And so that's sort of the threshold. That doesn't change the amount of money that Berkeley gives the student. So once they get to 6, it's sort of a set amount. And unfortunately, the number of units that have been paid for by the school keeps reducing. So for instance, Pell students got 7 units last year. Years before that, it was 9. But that was also when Pell went away for summer. So now that Pell is back. So Pell does have graduated levels for enrollment. So once a student, I think, hits, I think it's 11 units, maybe 9 to 11 units, then they would kick up in the number of Pell Grant, but it wouldn't impact the grant that you get from UC Berkeley.
Thank you, Laura. And sorry to make us a little bit late. We're a little bit behind schedule already, but there is another question, which is, does the data include the extension program, university extension?
No. So concurrent enrollment, that's sort of, it's relatively, I don't think it's not a thing in summer, I think, is basically the answer. So it's more of an academic year distinction.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. This is a great foundation for thinking about who's in our classrooms with us this summer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and sorry for going over time there.
No. That was lovely. Thank you so much. And I think we're moving on now to Sarah and Marisella.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you, Victoria, and thank you so much, Laura. I'm Sarah Pickett. If you're just joining us, I'm a senior consultant at the Center for Teaching and Learning. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joined by my colleague, Marisella. Would you jump in to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi again, everyone, and folks who are just joining us on the call. My name is Marisella Rodriguez, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm also a senior consultant with Sarah at the Center for Teaching and Learning.
All right. So it's great to be here with you all today. And in our next 30 minutes together, we are going to actually, Mari, would you pop to the next slide? Thank you so much. We are going to engage in a common experience together that will inform our then exploration of a strategy for supporting students, primarily through thinking about course design. But we bring this to folks, particularly given, again, thinking about the variety of student experiences that students are coming with and will have on our campus. And as an example, thinking about students that might be taking Berkeley classes for the first time. So to note, we'll do our best to answer questions in the chat, but we'll also collect questions and we're happy to share out responses after the session. Okay, so as we do often as part of CTL workshops, we're going to start the next segment with a common experience. We all come from different disciplines and fields of study, so it can be helpful to examine common things, whether they're familiar or unfamiliar, that we can draw on for our conversations. This activity was introduced to me by colleagues at SF State and Foothill College. And as we go through this activity, we encourage you to wear your instructor and student hats, if you will. I'll be wearing my instructor hat. Okay, so in this case, we're going to look at an activity called the montylation of troxylene. And before we start, I always like to ask, is there anyone who has studied troxylene before? I'll look through the videos just to see, wave if anyone has. Okay. Not seeing any hands. Well, let me just tell you, you are in for a treat. We are going to give you some information about troxylene so we can learn a little bit more about it. And then we're going to look at some questions as well. So Marisella, I know you previewed just a moment ago. Would you pop that paragraph back on and the 3 questions? So I'm going to just give folks a little bit of time to read this paragraph and the questions. So it'll be just a little bit, it'll be quiet on the call for just a few moments. And then we are also pasting a link into the chat so that you can access the document with the same text in case that's helpful to folks. I know it can be kind of small on the slide. So it'll be quiet for just a few moments. Okay, so we've had a couple of minutes to check out this passage and to look at the questions. And so I'll ask if a few members of our group would please volunteer to share your answers to each question in the chat. And so we'll go through one by one. Let's start with, what is troxylene? We could get a volunteer to pop their answer into the chat. Excellent, thank you, Jason. A new form of Zionter, thank you. And let's go to the next question. How is troxylene quazzled? If someone would be willing to volunteer their answer in the chat. Thank you very much to our volunteers. From Emily, thank you. Fevon crystallation and bractoration, excellent. Crystallating a large amount of Fevon and then bractoring it. Yes, absolutely, thank you. And our last one, why is it important to know about troxylene? One more volunteer to share in the chat. Or multiple folks are welcome to. Yes, absolutely. From Shanna or Shauna, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is one of our most localized SNES losses. So yes, absolutely. Thank you. So now that we've explored a bit about troxylene in this common experience, I'd like everyone to consider the following questions. And I'll read through the prompts and then I'll ask you to share your responses using an anonymous posting tool called Padlet. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So if you're thinking about this experience of learning about troxylene in a simulation, if you will, as a teacher in the simulation, do I have evidence that you learned about troxylene, if you can answer these questions? And as a student in the simulation, if you will, do you have evidence that you learned something about troxylene? Did you care about troxylene? Did you have a clear understanding of the expectations or outcome of this activity? And did you reflect on this process or your performance? So on the next slide, I'm going to show you what the Padlet looks like. So we're going to ask you to submit a response to at least one or more questions. It'll be not a lot of time, and I know there are a lot of questions. To post, you're going to click the plus button on the bottom right corner, and then you'll see an opportunity for a little post to come up, and you'll be able to share any responses that you'd like. And again, this will be anonymous. So Marisella popped that Padlet link in the chat. And if you would head to the next slide so we can have those questions up again. And so we'll give folks, again, a few moments to respond to one or more of the questions, whichever question you'd prefer. And again, it'll be just quiet on the call for a few minutes while we give folks a chance to respond. Okay, I still see a couple of things popping up, so I'll give folks just another few moments to share final thoughts. We'll keep it open, so you're welcome to add things, and we will share it also at the end of our session together today. All right. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts. I so appreciate your willingness to do so. I'll say that I'm seeing some commonalities as folks are looking through things, that perhaps we have some evidence of engagement, if you will, that students are reading and answering questions, and maybe that would connect to recall or sort of reading comprehension, but maybe doesn't tell us a lot about what students really understand or how they might apply information they know about Traxline from this experience. I appreciated a comment, and I saw a couple of things similar related to the idea that sort of the sense of feeling like I should care about Traxline, but maybe I don't. And so I think these are all really connected to thinking about how we are structuring our experiences for students. And that's important always, but can be particularly important in a summer session in a sort of that compressed timeline. So I want to end with a few key ideas in this segment. And the first is that, to be clear, Traxline does not exist, but it is not really an entirely abstract concept or excerpt, is that I would say that there can be jargon like this in any discipline, and there can be questions like this that appear in any content area. But beyond this, I think there's a key question, and that is, at the end of the term, what do we really hope students leave with or remember from our courses? And how does our instructional approach match those goals? So there, again, may be some evidence of engagement, but I think it's unlikely that folks will remember this particular information long-term, and we didn't try, but you'll have to take my word for it that most people don't remember the answers after even a few minutes. So to some extent, I'll say that the way we are structuring our courses will determine the type of learning, if you will, that we get from students, meaning the way they engage with our content in a particular way. And that also we can use our instructional choices to promote self-regulated learning, and we'll share more about that in a moment. So what principles are important for learning that might influence our approach? Very, very briefly, I'll share a condensation of many years of work from many fields in one slide. And that is just a few points. So I'll say, in the process of learning, learners must be awake, attending, and interested. This is sort of flippant, but important, especially in a remote space where our attention really can be divided. And I know, I think many of us as instructors can also identify with that. They need to be have opportunities to activate related knowledge and memory so they can connect these to new understandings. And then they're likely ready for constructing new knowledge or incorporating new information into their understanding. They need opportunities to practice, especially using new ideas in new contexts. And then finally, we need opportunities to, or students, all of us as learners, need opportunities to self-assess understanding and identify confusions. And this is valuable not only to students, but also to us as instructors to understand what our students are taking away and how they're thinking about different concepts in our courses. So I'm going to turn it over to Marisella to think more about why this is important for students and to dig more into our course design.
Thanks, Sarah. I must say, as always, when you do that activity, I just have so much fun every time about the Traxline. So I want to shift gears to really call back to a lot of the great information that Laura shared with us right before this segment, and to see if we can combine this potentially new knowledge about who our students might be and some strategies for effective teaching and learning that Sarah and I are hoping to just engage with you about. So as Laura mentioned, our summer students may be familiar with remote courses at Berkeley. They might be feeling a little bit burnt out on remote learning, and so we're pushing through it. And as they continue from spring, they may not be familiar with the intensity and really accelerated format of a summer session course and summer session learning. Also, summer students, as Laura mentioned, may be brand new to Berkeley altogether. Transfer students or new students from high school who are just starting their academic careers with us, which is exciting, but also can present some challenges about adapting to a new learning context. And in these cases, they're also experiencing new elements of their pacing with regard to their learning. So we know that students are likely to be juggling multiple responsibilities in addition to their summer coursework. So how can we support them to adapt to this new learning environment and this new pacing? One way to help support students is to help them develop the skill set to be self-guided or self-regulated learners. Now, self-regulated learning is a cyclical process where a student plans for a task, monitors their performance, and then reflects on that outcome. The cycle then repeats itself as a student uses this process to reflect and adjust and then prepare for that next task. Now, the figure to the right illustrates these key steps of the process. And to implement some of these key steps, we really need to know the ins and out of our course to know when those strategic moments happen in our courses, when students might struggle to learn, or when it's a really pivotal moment for students to reflect on everything that they've learned so far and adjust before the next big task. So while it might not be maybe the most obvious starting point, but to be able to implement this cycle, we really need to think deeply and intentionally about our course designs. So that's where I'm going to shift us and our attention to. And when I think about effective course design, really alignment just immediately pops into my head. And I want to be mindful that alignment may be a new concept to some and definitely review for others. So I'm just going to take a step back and walk us through this idea of alignment. Now, this piece of intentional course design and this practice of course design can be so important because we have a compressed timeline with student learning in the summer courses. And so when we think about designing our courses, there are three key elements that we oftentimes consider: learning objectives, assessments, and instructional activities. And when we talk about alignment, we're really talking about the relationship between these three things. How are they working together in tandem around the main skill or topic or concept that we really need students to learn, so that there's elements of scaffolding throughout our entire semester. And these three key pieces actually have a very clear starting point, even though the figure is a triangle and a multi-directional approach. But research would suggest that we should be thinking about the end. And when I say the end, I mean when students leave our course, whether they walk out the door or they log off that last Zoom call, what is the thing that I really need them to learn? And if they didn't, I would feel as an educator a bit of regret because they didn't learn this important thing by the end of the semester. For many folks in a course, that's anywhere from 3 to 8 learning objectives, depending on how many courses you have in a semester, or excuse me, lessons. So once you've identified those key skills, topics, and strategies, it's really time to think about what are the assessments that I will design for students so that they can demonstrate their learning growth to me, that they've had an opportunity to showcase to me that they've learned something through our time together. And then that third piece is thinking about what are the everyday things that I do in my course, whether that's my lectures, homework assignments, or quizzes that prepare students to meet these assessments so that they are ready to go with how they plan to demonstrate and showcase their knowledge to me and maybe their peers. So when we start with the end in thinking about the alignment in our course, I really like to take a step back to think about how should we be crafting learning objectives? What are the key things that we should be looking for? And I always like to share that learning objectives are such an important tool for students so that they know what we expect of them, what they're expected to learn and to do in the course. And for learning objectives, there are 3 clear criteria of when we think we've accomplished a successful learning objective. The first piece is that they are student-centered. It's not quite about what I will teach in a course, it's about what my students will learn. And as Sarah mentioned, there's a whole body of work that indicates that students learn best when it's an active learning experience. That generates the experience to a more meaningful place for them, where their knowledge becomes stickier for them when we ask them to recall or just continue to think about the material weeks after a lesson. And learning objectives should also be measurable. Again, we need to create and build those opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning to us. You may be looking at these 3 pieces and think, didn't you just cover that in alignment? And you wouldn't be wrong. The intuition is that these are closely tied together, these concepts of alignment and effective learning objectives. But right now we're in this realm of, okay, I think this is easy enough, but how do I do it for my course? So I'm going to show you one example from a political science course. One example of an effective learning objective is this, and I'll go ahead and read it out loud. By the end of the course, students should be able to apply international relations theory to explain the cause of international conflict and hypothesize an evidence-based resolution. So I've color-coded some key phrases in this learning objective where you can see we're very focused on students. The thing that we're asking students to do is apply an international theory, and how they can demonstrate their learning to me is by explaining it effectively, how it can explain the cause of an international conflict, and that they will take an evidence-based approach to support their claim. Once we have a learning objective that we feel is strong enough to communicate what students should be expected to do and to learn, the next question that we can use to check our course design is again coming back to alignment. How can I craft an assessment that really gives students the opportunity to demonstrate the skill that I want them to do of applying an international relations theory to essentially a real-world context? One thing that the instructor in this political science course does is they ask students to write an assignment where they have to explain the start of the Afghanistan war using one international relations theory, realism or liberalism, and they have to give evidence to support their claim. So you might see some connections here again on how this assessment is closely tied to the essence of that learning objective. And the instructional activities that this instructor might is asking students to read pieces about realism and liberalism. They might have conversations with students connecting these theories to explain different real-world conflicts. So we're giving them conceptual context and real-world context day to day. So this is an example of what we might say is effective, is aligned here. But I also want to give you an opportunity to think about a new example where there might be some challenges. So I'd like you to put your student hat on again and imagine that you are reading a course syllabus and you're reading this learning objective and assessment. And I want you to think, is it clear what you are expected to learn and do? I'll read this out loud and then ask you to share in the chat. The learning objective is, by the end of the course, students should be able to understand the relationship between maternity leave policies and economic growth. And the assessment is a video presentation where students record a video describing the evolution of these policies in 20th century. I'll stop there and just take a peek at the chat, and whenever you have a thought that you'd like to share about whether this is working well for you or not, feel welcome to share it. I'm so appreciative of the comments that are coming through the chat because they are pulling at things that I always gravitate towards as items that need adjustment. For me, when I think about my course, I have such a stickling feeling about using understand. Someone shared that it's so vague and abstract, and I would agree. And also the nature of this learning objective is giving an essence of critical thinking. It wants students to understand some kind of relationship. And the assessment here is really focusing on describing something. And that was also called out in the chat. So I would absolutely agree that the alignment and also the learning objective itself here can maybe do some work. So I want to just show you some tools as we shift gears towards a wrap up that could be useful to you in how you plan and start to think about your own course. First is this Bloom's taxonomy figure. This is a great way to help organize for your own course design what kind of cognitive skills you're asking students to do throughout the duration of your course. And we really want skills to be a mix of things that students can look up on this bottom level of the pyramid here. And then also things that students have to try really hard almost to figure out, where they're applying things, they're creating, evaluating. Just by the nature of these words, that already signals more effort. So how can we build a course that starts with foundational activities or knowledge and then builds to something a bit more advanced? The next tool that I want to share with you is this course mapping template that colleagues in Digital Learning Services and also the Center for Teaching and Learning have created, which is a way for you to organize your thinking with everything that I've shared with you, starting with the end in mind, a backwards design approach. And my colleague Sarah is going to share a link to this template in the chat that is accessible to all Berkeley instructors. And I just filled it out myself for what this segment that I facilitated looks like in this template. We'll go ahead and share this slide deck so you can look at some of these pieces in greater detail. But I'll just share that I wanted you all to explore course design strategies to help guide your thinking. I assessed you with a very quick chat in the Zoom. I didn't grade you on anything, but it was great to see that we were thinking similar about the thought exercise. And then some of the activities that I shared with you are really geared towards topics, course alignment, effective learning objectives, Bloom's taxonomy. And then the learning environment that I used today, since many of you will be teaching remotely, I used Zoom, PowerPoint slides, and lots of images for you. So as you're thinking about your own course and all of these tools that we just kind of threw at your attention, please don't forget that there's support available for you to help walk you through these pieces. And one of those supports, along with our AC colleagues on the call, is the Center for Teaching and Learning. My colleague Sarah will likely be sharing a link to connect with us in the chat, and always feel welcome to reach out. I'm going to go ahead and actually toss it back to Sarah to close us out.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As Marisella mentioned, we will share the slides and our contact info, so please feel welcome to reach out to us. I'm always struck by this as sort of we started by thinking about student self-learning and reflection, and I love this as a process also for us as instructors to be reflective in our approach. So I think at this point, I am kicking us off to a break. And so we will go for 10 minutes and be back at 11:11. I am delighted to introduce our next speaker for today's segment, Professor Glynda Hull from the Graduate School of Education, Professor of Education. I have a little bit to share about Glynda, and then I'll share a little bit about our format for this segment. Glynda has extensive expertise around online learning spaces and digital technologies in education, both through her research and scholarship, as well as in her own teaching. In addition, Glynda holds many roles on campus, including the Elizabeth H. and Eugene A. Shurtleff Chair in Undergraduate Education. She's the chair of the Committee on Teaching, and she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses. She's also an esteemed recipient of the UC Berkeley Distinguished Teaching Award. So it's wonderful to have her joining us. Thank you so much, Glynda. Before we dive in, Glynda, I'll share just a little bit about our segment. Glynda's going to share a few opening words about her teaching values and approach, particularly thinking about a remote format. And then following that, we'll have an opportunity for members of our group to generate questions for Glynda. And so to hear from many voices, we'll actually do that using the web tool Padlet again, which you'll have just experienced. And then we'll use a quick breakout session to allow you to brainstorm with colleagues and then come back together. So with that, Glynda, I'll kick off with a question to sort of spark your thoughts. Many of us now, although perhaps not everyone, have experienced teaching in a remote environment, but there are still many challenges and considerations to keep in mind. So as someone who's been on the forefront of leveraging technology to facilitate your pedagogical work, how would you describe your path to online teaching?
Thank you, Sarah. And good morning, everyone. I'm just paging through the Zoom windows, and it's great to see you or see your pictures. It's quite a privilege to get to come in and talk to you about teaching, and especially teaching in an online world and in digital spaces. So the approach I'm going to take in the minutes I have with you is really to speak to you as teacher to teacher, instructor to instructor, not as a technology aficionado or an instructional designer or a learning scientist or any of those things. I've gotten so much joy from teaching over the years. And one of my, I would probably say my major identity on campus is just squarely situated within being a teacher and finding ways to create classrooms, both digitally in online spaces and also in in-person spaces where we can all grow and flourish. And that's how I want to come at my remarks to you today. And I hope that spirit can infuse the conversations that we have. So I wanted to say, to kick us off, wanted to say just a little bit about how I came to the online world, which is a space now that I hesitate to say it, but I actually, how dare I say it, I prefer teaching sometimes in online spaces. I actually look forward to it and prefer it. So I'm hoping I'll be able to reveal to you the source of some of that questionable enthusiasm. So I got interested in teaching online about 10 years ago. And at the time I was still teaching in the time-honored method of standing and delivering lectures. I really enjoyed it. I liked the performative aspects of it. I liked organizing information and presenting it to students. And I liked seeing the faces in front of me and just finding ways to interact even in that constrained space. But as time passed, I began to suspect that I was not doing enough for my students, and actually they weren't doing enough for me. I began to see that I was working a good bit harder than they were to put together my classes and to entertain them and to keep them engaged. And I wanted to find a way to use the term that Marisella used earlier. I wanted to find a way to engage them in active learning. I wanted to take the concepts of my course and have them somehow experience them instead of have me tell them about them. So as luck would have it at the time, social media and social networks had just started taking the world by storm. And I began to do some research around social media. And I began to try to think, this is eons ago, before there was even a Facebook out there, or at least one that was popularly known, began to think about, well, how can we take some of these ways of interacting and capture some of the enthusiasm that young people seem to have for being in online spaces? How can we take that and use it in a university classroom? So I put my head together with a great group of graduate students and actually some technology experts on campus as well. And I turned my class upside down. I took my lecture course and I held it upside down and I kind of shook it and see what fell out as the most important kinds of learnings and concepts and activities that I wanted to keep. And then I set about reimagining those things in an online space. And what I did not want to do, and I was determined not to do, was just rely on the traditional way of doing online at the time, which was really just to take your lecture and make a version of it, an online version of it, put it there, and everybody read it or listened to it. They read your text, and then that was it pretty much. I did not want to do that. I wanted to create a different kind of online space, and creating that space just engaged me for several years. And with the help of a team that I mentioned before, I was able to come up with, I think, some pedagogical and technological innovations that I'll share with you a bit later. So now, at this moment, after we've all experienced remote instruction and everybody has come to, almost has had to delve into some version of online, where it's such a different space than we were way back when. And we have many, many more opportunities to do interesting things now than we could earlier on. But I think, I think the same ideas about what counts as great teaching, really innovative instruction, work that pulls your students in and allows you to share with them what you know and allows them to share with you who they are and what they want to learn. I think some of the same principles actually inform us now, as informed me early on, and actually as informed good teaching in general. And I'll sound a little simplistic here, but I think that, at Berkeley, we so much value fine instructional content, and whether it's a course in Spanish linguistics or a course in neuroscience or a course in engineering or an R&C course on teaching writing, we all want to be excellent at delivering the things that our students need to know. And I think you can do that actually online or in a hybrid format in as powerful a way as you can do it in person, as I hope we get to talk a little bit about later on. But then the other thing that goes hand in hand with this for me is finding ways to make teaching and learning really engaging, dare I say fun, actually fun, so that both we and our students are kind of energized at the end of the class, and we feel as if we've experienced something together that has changed us a little bit along the way. That notion of teaching as engaging and also as inclusive, as finding ways that enable everybody to participate in some fashion, that notion of teaching is long-standing. It's always been associated with good teaching. And I think it's possible, I think it's just as possible in an online environment, in online space, in the structure, the whole structure of an online experience as it is in person. And I hope we get to explore that just a little bit. So I'll say one more thing and then we'll go to our Padlet activities. So a long time ago, a revered professor on campus who actually had been a K-12 teacher before she became a professor here at Berkeley. She had this idea about how when a teacher goes into a classroom, this is the way she said it. She said, we go into our classrooms, I shut my door and the world begins. I go into my classroom and somehow I'm able to create with my students this space where everybody can be better than they are in the outside world. We can all be smarter. We can all be more humane. We can all sometimes even be funnier, more entertaining. And it's that special notion of a space, whether it's exactly as I described it there or not, but it's that notion of the space that we all as individual instructors can come to create, that I think we want to aim for in our online hybrid worlds as well as in our in-person worlds in teaching. And what those spaces are, how you come across in them, of course, depends on who you are as a teacher and where your comfort level is in terms of interacting with students, and also what you're teaching and the innovative ways you can get it across. But I just submit to you this notion that that special space is something that we're all aspiring to create in person and also in hybrid spaces and online spaces, and it's possible. Okay, I think I'll stop there, Sarah.
Thank you, Glynda, and for that call to action and thinking about our spaces that we create virtually and in person. So as we mentioned, we want to have an opportunity for multiple voices to raise questions, for continuing to engage with and chat with Glynda. And so we're going to do that again using the Padlet board. So I'm going to pop a link to that into the chat so folks have access to it. And we'll take just a moment for folks to think first. So if you have a question, you need that moment, just feel welcome to sort of think about that in post. But then we are going to break into small groups with colleagues, again, to give folks an opportunity to brainstorm and continue posting if you wish, and then we'll come back together. So it'll be quiet for just a moment, and then we'll open the breakout rooms. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open the breakouts in just a moment. We'll be there for about 10 minutes. Feel welcome as you're discussing to comment on other questions or to like things that, if you have a similar question, and we'll kind of the board will continue to populate. Please introduce yourselves when you get to your room. If you are working with colleagues you have not met before, we suggest sharing your name, your pronouns, and your department. And because sometimes this can be helpful to groups, I'll suggest that the person with the longest hair shares first. Okay, I'm going to open the groups. So we are going to open the floor back up to Glynda, and I'll say that you've please feel welcome to continue posting your questions on the Padlet board. We will use that to draw on for the questions. If there's another question that comes up, please feel welcome to paste it into the chat, or to use the raise hand function if you'd like to share out verbally. So Glynda, perhaps we could start because it's a popular topic on our board, and a question I had for you as well, to think about participation, maybe some challenges and strategies, and what's important about thinking about those.
Oh, super. Thank you. Thank you for that entree. Worrying about participation, how to get students to engage online it's kind of one of my favorite topics. And I think it's sort of the conundrum that everybody faces who's teaching remotely. And I've actually, if you wouldn't mind, would bear with me for a minute. I've developed a few techniques over time that you probably have encountered yourselves or invented yourselves too. And I'll just list a few of them as examples of ways of getting students engaged. I start out by, from the very first class, trying to build relationships with students. As I was saying to Anna and Marisella in our breakout room, when I was teaching in person, I would always go around to students in the lecture hall, walk up and down the aisles of the lecture hall and say, hey, what did you think about the readings last night? Weren't they exciting? Aren't you jazzed about what we are going to cover in class today? And eventually my students would be able to say to me, oh, Professor Hall, I didn't get to do the readings last night. I actually, I had a midterm, and it would give me a chance to just interact with them and to start a conversation about the class, but also start a conversation about where they are and what their concerns are. And it allowed us to get to know each other a little bit. I think you can do the same thing in Zoom. You can open your Zoom room early a bit, and you can go around the room and simply call on folks and say, oh, Jason, how are you today, Jason? Or Ying.
I'm excellent, thank you.
I appreciate that. And why are you so excellent, Jason? Why are you so? So I'd continuing that way and get a conversation going with folks in the room, just to build relationships, just to let them see you are a human instructor and you recognize that they are human students and you want to get to know them a little bit. I try to take that more formally into creating norms for participating. So one of the things we do usually in the very first class is to jointly in breakout rooms create a list of the things that would help them learn in our digital space. A lot of times students come up with things like, well, everybody needs to mute to begin with. They're very Zoom savvy now, but pretty quickly they begin to mention things like tolerate diverse opinions or make sure everyone participates. So we take these norms and list them on a slide and present them to the class the next time and ask students, hey, these are the norms that we came up with. Karina, could you please read them through and let's everybody listen and see if you still agree with them or if we need to add more. And you don't have to do that forever, but a few times remind students of the community norms, the joint understandings that you constructed together about how to participate. And sometimes students will even bring up cameras. And I know dealing with not having cameras on is a real bugaboo. And people have various ways of addressing this. And I know on campus we were told last fall to just let students have their cameras off. actually don't do that. And I say to students right at the beginning, gee, I really need to see you. And so unless you are having internet difficulty, why don't please try to have your camera on. So I just try to do that. And I'm not hard and fast about it. If students don't want to, then I don't make them, of course, but I do encourage it. And I find that it helps a lot. And one of the things I notice in breakout rooms when students are really engaged, they have a lot of times they'll have their cameras on. Yeah. So I have some other suggestions, but I want to pause a minute to see if anybody wants to jump in with a particular question, or if you'd like me to kind of trot along with these other ideas that I've gleaned about increasing participation. So what do you think, Sarah? Should I just go forward and say a little bit more?
Yes, I think so, Glynda. Yeah, if there are a couple more points that you'd like to add, and I'm queuing up in my mind a couple of additional questions that have popped up in the board.
Okay. So I know that if you've taught on Zoom before, you figured out that there are multiple paths to participation. And that includes the chat. It includes speaking in small groups. It includes taking part in activities in small groups. And it can also include taking part in synchronous activities outside of the class. So what I aim for is to enable participation in some way by all the students in the class. It may not be the same kind of participation. It may be that students genuinely appreciate being able to chat rather than to speak in the whole group. So I try to accommodate students' preferences, but I want everybody to participate. And I actually have a participation grade that includes the various things that I just mentioned, and I kind of tally up the points midterm and end of term, and try to get students to know that through the grading, but also through the participant structures that we create in class, that I really value their being a part of a conversation. I can say a little bit about more about that later, but I want to mention one more thing that I found to be really helpful in terms of getting students to participate in breakout rooms, because I think you just can't assume that, you think, oh, you put students in breakout rooms, they have a chance to chat. But often they don't take that opportunity, and they sometimes just keep their cameras off, and sometimes they'll message you and say, oh, nobody's talking in my breakout room, and man, that is just deadly. So the thing that I found about breakout rooms is that if you give students an activity, a genuine activity, not just a discussion question, but some kind of activity, and you even on occasion assign roles. So one person's going to do this, one person's going to do that, and one person's going to do this over here, that it really gives them a way to begin and a process for proceeding. And also, if you ask them, if you have a slide deck, let's say you have a PowerPoint that's guiding your section or your class that night, if you have a slide deck, you can actually ask them to create their own slide. Each breakout room will create their own slide in that slide deck to report back. And then when you come back in the main room, they have something to speak from. I found that kind of activity, that kind of structured activity, really can work wonders. And I'll give you one quick example of something that I've done. And this is an activity that's it's wildly popular in my class, in my education class, and partly because students have fun doing it, but partly also because it really illustrates a construct. And so in my class, I won't bore you with a huge number of details, but I have students read the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin and his thinking about language. And one of the things I want them to understand is the notion of addressivity, which simply put means that anytime you say something, write something, or communicate, you're anticipating a response, and you're really imagining how your audience is going to respond. It's very abstract when students approach it in the reading. So in the breakout rooms for this activity, I have an activity I called Mind Meld. I give them a set of instructions that essentially say, two of you are going to say a word simultaneously, and you're going to try to say the same word. One person is going to keep time. Another person is going to observe a whole list of roles. And students will quickly get into this activity, and they'll each jointly say a word. And of course, the word is quite different. And then they'll try again, and the word will be closer in domain than it was before. And some of them eventually actually say the same word. But gee, golly whiz, they love that kind of active activity, where they're actually doing something. And when they get insight about a construct they didn't understand, that is just icing on the cake. That's really where the magic happens. Here, I'll stop there for a minute. I apologize to you if I'm talking too much, you guys. I get very
Not at all.
Glynda, sorry, Sarah, can I jump in a second?
Please do.
So Glynda, can I ask a question which really comes from the Padlet board and some of the conversations, which is that because summer is so condensed and everything's going to be really fast, that coupled with, I think, some of the techniques that faculty have developed to be hybrid in terms of synchronous engagement and asynchronous, so doing some pre-prepared, pre-recorded. Do you have experience over what combination works best, given that the summer is so fast-paced? Any advice that you would have for synchronous and asynchronous combinations?
Well, I would rely at least 50-50 on asynchronous. I would give a healthy set of activities, not just readings, of course readings, but also perhaps short videos, other materials you glean from the web, and activities that students can themselves participate in synchronously, but by themselves in collaboration. I do that. I would do that in summer sessions more so than I would even do that in the regular semester. And another tip I would give you, and this actually applies to both summer sessions and the regular semester when you're teaching remotely or online or in a hybrid format. So what you'll want to do is establish a regular routine where students know what is due when. And there's just no question about that. The way I do this is I have constructed something I call it a pedagogical arc. And it's really the kinds of activities that students will engage in. Some of the activities I call Inspire, which actually ask students to access their content knowledge and draw on their own experiences. Then there are activities that I call Explore, which are readings and videos. Then there are activities which I call Research, which are usually engaging in some synchronous activities around how to do the particular kind of research that I teach. And then there's activities that I call Collaborate, which ask students to do things together. Now, these types of activities occur every week in the same order. And students do them in the same time frame. So the first part of the week, or say in summer sessions, your first class, if you're dividing your summer week into 2 classes, students will know they're going to work on Inspire and Explore. The second part of the week, they'll know they're going to work on Research and Collaborate. And they get into that routine of knowing what kinds of activities through this pedagogical arc, so to speak, and when they're due. And I think that's hugely important to make kind of crystal clear, and to provide that sort of scaffolding that will allow students to find their way quickly and not get lost in the maze of remote instruction and all the things that we ask them to do so quickly. I'm sorry to go so quickly myself over that. And if any of you have a question about this, or you'd like to chat more, I'd love to do so outside today. Yeah.
Glynda, may I ask a question about, so somebody asked in the Padlet board about the idea of how do you engage the students outside of the class, because it's so intense, relationships might not have been established. At the end of today's session, we're going to have what we call corridor hour, which is what you would do if you're in a physical space. You'd actually just hang out, ask questions. It creates more of a kind of a casual engagement. Are there any other ways that you might give advice of how to structure those relationships that are outside of the formal classroom space?
Yes, I wouldn't leave them to chance at all. And I would provide more directions on how to engage and around what. So everybody has probably used discussion boards, and that's one kind of way that you can engage. You'll find, I think, that students tire of discussion boards pretty quickly. And so you'll want to take that into account when you're imagining them in your course. Let me give you an example of a tool that I use. It's actually one that my team created. It's part of the Suite C set of tools that all of you have access to. The particular tool in the Suite C set that's so helpful to me is something called the Asset Library. And it's really just a place to archive stuff. You can archive videos and you can archive images, you can archive readings, etc. So each week in my Inspire activities, I ask students to add something to the asset library. I give them really concrete instructions on what to do. Of course, the education course I teach for undergrads is about literacy. And one of the things I want to do is expand how they think about literacy. So the first assignment for the asset library that they do offline is to add an asset. It can be an image, it can be something they create themselves, it can be a video, and they answer the question, how do you define literacy? Here at the beginning. And then the asset library allows you to comment. And I say, comment on two of your colleagues, your classmates' assets, and comment about how they're similar to or different from yours. So there's pretty explicit feedback on, directions on how to engage and around what. And then the other thing I do is I model like crazy. I go into the asset library. I say, oh, gee golly, wow, man, this is pretty interesting what you did here. I want to ask you this. So I engage. I give a model of how to engage, and I also comment on comments. So I reward students for making a wonderful comment on their classmates' asset as well. So I'd encourage you to explore that tool and see how it could work into your class, whatever the subject matter is. And but I'd also encourage you to, as you use it, to provide directions as part of the activities you ask students to engage in on what to do with the tool.
Thank you so much. So Sarah, shall I pass it to you? I think we may be closing out.
Yes, I think we are at the end of our time, but I sense that we could continue this conversation for much longer. But thank you so much, Glynda, for sharing your experience and expertise, and to folks for sharing your questions. We will hold on to the Padlet board and we'll share it out, but also we'll keep track of those questions. So if there are resources and things we can share out after, we will definitely do so. And again, thank you so much, Glynda. Great to have you, and for sharing your wisdom with us. And I think at this point, I'm turning it back over to you, Victoria, for our next segment.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, this is wonderful. I feel energy even though we're on Zoom. Thank you, Glynda. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Marisella. And right now we're at that moment in the Teaching in Summer workshop where we're going to do a big dive into the particularity of American cultures. But I think everybody can really engage with the premises that are written in the American cultures curriculum, which is that we have the opportunity to have conversations on the ways in which race and its intersections shape, show up, and complicate and organize our lives. And we have two incredible instructors within the American Cultures program, Karina Palau and John Dougherty. And Karina is a continuing lecturer within the Department of Comparative Literature. And John is a continuing lecturer within the Department of Ethnic Studies and Native American Studies. I have learned so much from them. I am really grateful that they're here to foster a dialogue with you that's really centered in equity and anti-racism work. Over to you, Karina and John.
Great, thank you so much. That was such an incredible introduction. And to Glynda, what a wonderful presentation. It's really difficult to follow that up. And I think we're going to be echoing some of the things that Glynda mentioned in the previous section, just because they're pretty universal in how we approach our own summer courses, which is really which is really amazing. For both Karina and I, we've been teaching these courses for so long. And one of the things that I observed first was that, when we started doing these courses, this summer workshop didn't exist. This summer workshop on just some practical tips on how to approach summer courses didn't exist. And it's so a thank you to Victoria, thank you to Doug, thank you to the American Cultures for putting together this particular program. It's really amazing. So much of what we learned on how to approach summer courses back before this workshop was done really informally, was done by asking people who had done it, or done by taking someone out to coffee and picking their ear for a few minutes on what is the best practices for approaching these issues in a summer session, which poses its really unique challenges. And so the format for today is really meant to be informal. We put together some of the big questions that we feel are out there, but it's really for you to ask questions about what are just the practical components of putting together these courses over the summer, and also just to sort of address some of the day-to-day realities that it takes. And so before we get going, I think introductions are in order. Karina, do you want to say anything to start us off?
No, just mostly that John and I have really thought about this as an open conversation. Since I am the one who's going to be sharing my screen, please note that I don't always see your chats pop up. So maybe if we can all kind of help each other with that. I'm dealing with a little tiny laptop screen here, but just please know that we want to just create opportunities for open questions and open conversation. So you're always welcome to interrupt us, raise a virtual hand, and or add to chat. And if any of our co-facilitators today could just help me out and let me know if there's something important that pops up in chat, as I'm not able to view it when I'm sharing my screen. And thanks for having us. I guess that's the only other thing I wanted to say.
Do you want to move us to the first big question? One of the things that's really fun about this workshop is it provides us the opportunity to reflect on the many years that we've been doing these summer courses. In my case, this will be, I don't know if it's depressing or happy, but it's the 15th summer in a row that I'm going to be teaching summer courses, and it gives you the opportunity. This workshop the last few years has given me the opportunity to sort of reflect on what has worked and what hasn't worked, and some of the challenges of just the day-to-day reality of teaching these summer courses, especially the AC summer courses. And like all of us, I think the last year has really posed unique challenges. Not just in the practical nature of doing a summer course, but an online summer course, and also a course that's trying to really put into perspective the whirlwind of what's been happening socially and politically over the last 12 months. And trying to do that in person is one challenge, but trying to do that remotely is a whole other challenge. And before we get into these questions, I really just wanted to say that our time here is always short. These segments always go by so quickly. And anything Karina and I say is meant to be things to think about. It's meant to be things to consider and to maybe practice and to maybe put into play at some point over the summer. But there's no button to push that's going to suddenly make your course sort of address all these really complicated issues in an instant. You have to practice. You have to try out new things. You have to fail with things. You have to slowly do these things in a way that builds on them. And over time, you begin to fine tune what works, and you kind of ditch the stuff that doesn't work. So I know these sections can be really overwhelming. But first and foremost, I just wanted to take the stress off a little bit and to just say these are things to think about, and that these are things to consider, and to things that maybe you put in action. And we're happy to talk more about the specifics as we move forward. The first of our big three questions is, how do I approach designing a summer course with equity in mind? Based off of some of your previous panels that you've had today, we really don't want to be redundant with a few features. And so one of the things I first and foremost wanted to describe in terms of designing a summer course and some of the things to think about, there's already the logistics of, how do you take 15 weeks, 16 weeks, 17 weeks, including the finals week of content, and suddenly make that manageable in 6 weeks, a very fast 6 weeks, mind you. And I think some of the topics you've covered today have talked about maybe some of the practical nature of putting that together, designing learning goals, putting together learning objectives for the students to follow. But in addition to what you're considering for your own course, I really want to ask you to flip the camera around and ask questions about your students and how your students are going to be doing. I know one of the sections you had earlier was talking about demographics over the summer, and that is so critical just because it's quite consistent, at least in my summer courses over time, that I have a 17-year-old who is an early admit that this might be their first course in the same class with someone who walked recently and just graduated. And summer students are often people who travel to Berkeley, in this case virtually, just for the summer. And so you have students in your classes who are working with different levels of skills from different parts of the globe. And you're talking about oftentimes small courses. And when you're in a small course, these differences can really amplify, right? It's really difficult to have these things sort of disappear into a large class. And so it's oftentimes that these issues amplify. With that said, summer courses can be really challenging for students. And I say that with the specificity of this year in mind. Last summer, I was gifted with a few students who let me know that they don't have internet at home, or they're babysitting, or they've taken on a few extra shifts at work to help pay rent. These are very common, whether we want to think about this or not. These are common things that our students are dealing with. And when you think about your side of this, of trying to cram 15 weeks into 6 weeks, that often means, practically speaking, that they have assignments to do every week. And they have a lot of reading to do every week. And, we'd have students who slip. And in a normal semester, those slips can be recovered. They can slip and they can bring themselves back up and they can, get current with assignments. For a lot of students, given the extra stresses they have at home right now, many of them still remote, missing 1 week, slipping for 1 week, not being able to stay up on top of reading for just 1 week, already puts them in a significant hole. And you can slip and slide down the hill really quickly with students over the summertime. What adds an extra wrinkle to this is this idea that we're remote and we don't have the same check-in mechanisms as we do with students. And so this is, long story short, I just want to say, I'm going to turn over to Karina here, is just to be mindful when you're putting together these courses. There's so much to consider just in terms of designing a good course. But oftentimes we don't think about the stress or the day-to-day realities of our students. And we want our students to succeed. And I think there's practical things we can put in place to make sure our students make it through these courses successfully and effectively. And I think more often than not, that just asks us to consider the unique situations that our students are bringing in virtually into the classroom. Karina, do you have anything to say on that one?
Yeah, I guess just in terms of thinking about sort of practical application here, something that I've been thinking about a lot over this now plus year that we've been, teaching in such difficult circumstances. I really appreciated one of my colleagues when I attended the AC Center's Winter Institute, who described us as teaching and learning in crisis. That was a phrase that came up that just resonated so much with me, because I of course, I'm a teacher on this campus, but I'm also a learner, and I have to think about how it is that my students are experiencing this moment, and they are also doing their best to learn in a moment of tremendous multifaceted crises. And so with that in mind, I think something that we can, sort of proactively do as instructors is remove, or at least help remove, the stigma against asking for help. I think, having a B courses page or a discussion board that students contribute to, or a section of your syllabus where you refer students, to the Basic Needs Center, to DSP, to academic accommodations. I do not mean to suggest that, just giving students websites or phone numbers somehow makes these issues go away. But I do think that particularly at Berkeley, I encounter a lot of students who often are, they really struggle to ask for the help that they need. Student Learning Center, free tutoring services, all of these sorts of things. Students often want to look for, but they don't know where to find them. And they're also afraid to ask. So if we take away that stigma and we create a web page or a section of our site, that just gives them, some shortcuts so that they can get in touch with these offices and with people and with resources. I think that can be something that we can it's simple, but it's something that we can do proactively to support students. Anybody want to ask a question? I see there are a couple of chats, but I can't read them. Does anybody want to jump in with a question before I move to kind of the next slide or section?
Karina, I just wanted to underline, thank you for that last point about this designated B course space, because given the data that Laura just shared of the number of first-time UC Berkeley students, the idea of imposter syndrome might be very sharp in people's minds about Berkeley students don't ask for support. So thank you again for identifying that.
Yeah, thank you. Also, something that I've been doing is sometimes creating a discussion board or creating some sort of space where students can post anonymously. B courses doesn't really exactly allow for that. But if students want to share resources, but they feel uncomfortable having their names attached to those posts, then that can be another opportunity. Even something like a Google Doc can work for that, so that students can include and compile different resources and links, but not have things associated with their particular name. Just to kind of also build on practical application, I guess maybe to sort of build off of what Glynda shared with us, I do have to say it's always hard for me to follow Glynda Hull in any of these sort of events, because she just never fails to inspire and blow me away, and also remind me just sort of why it is that we, particularly within these tremendously difficult circumstances, want to keep teaching. But to kind of just extend, or offer some practical ideas for how to implement some of the suggestions that she already brought up, I wanted to talk about some potential best practices for remote / online teaching, since that is what we all are looking at doing in the case of this particular summer. And I wanted to emphasize a couple of features that are easily implemented. I know, right, for many of us, summer teaching starts in a couple weeks, right? I myself am finalizing my syllabus, building my B courses page. It happens very quickly. So my goal here is to share some really practical tips that will take you just a short amount of time to implement, rather than require you to go through some sort of massive overhaul. So I collected just a couple of pieces of advice. The first, and this is probably going to sound familiar to any of you who have been teaching online already, and I want to emphasize that today, at least in terms of the surveys that you all filled out, we had kind of a mix, right? Some of us had acquired a lot of remote teaching experience, and others of us were going to be new to it. So I'm going to try to kind of speak to something that I hope would help everybody, no matter whether you've done this before or not. But I think it is really important to not expect that we can transfer a 2-hour class. Okay, keep in mind that summer classes tend to be longer in terms of the amount of time that people are typically asked to spend in the classroom. I think it's very important for us to not expect to transfer that time from a classroom to a Zoom room, okay? So even something as simple as shortening meeting times or offering breaks, 5-minute breaks, 10-minute breaks, play some music, encourage everyone to, feel free to turn off their camera, stay in the Zoom room, but stretch, get a glass of water, right? Serve themselves a snack. All of those things can make a tremendous difference, I would say, not only in terms of, sort of helping students stay engaged and stay awake. That was something that Sarah and Marisol talked about a little while ago, right? And the importance of keeping our students awake and engaged. But also this will help in terms of participation. So students also have needs, and their ability to focus is challenged when we are asking them to engage us and engage each other and engage complex materials via a screen. And so keep in mind that shortening meeting times and also just encouraging breaks can be something simple that you can do, but it can be very, very helpful. Also making Zoom meetings as interactive as possible. So breaking them up. If you do have a large expanse of 50 minutes or an hour that you are expecting your students to all be together, right? All be on Zoom, all be engaged. Try using breakout rooms, try using some of the activities, Zoom polling. Today, we've seen some great examples of how Padlet and also how using the chat function can help. But I would also just encourage everybody to potentially think about using breakout rooms. And this is, I think, is particularly important in light of the theme that that John and I were asked to talk about today in terms of equity and anti-racism pedagogies. And what we're thinking about here when it comes to breakout rooms is creating opportunities for students to connect with one another and to ask questions that may be difficult for them to pose, or questions that may be difficult for them to discuss, or opinions, right, or responses that may be difficult for them to share in a larger group. So having breakout room activities that are structured, but that also encourage students to build community and to have tough conversations with each other can be important. So I'm running out of time here. I did also just want to share one super practical tip with all of you. So Glynda talked about the possibility of, taking the summer and using an arc approach to plan each and every week so that you have different stages to the week, and students are maybe at some points participating asynchronously and other points participating synchronously. But the idea is that they're pacing themselves through the stages of the week, through the materials on a similar schedule so that they can continue to cultivate community. I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a second, and I just wanted to share with all of you one of the ways in which, I have been able to build this kind of weekly arc into my summer courses. And actually it's something that I've now started doing in all of my courses that I think both helps support student learning and honestly helps me stay organized as an instructor. So I think creating a weekly pattern and sticking to it is one of the best pieces of advice that I can offer you for summer instruction, and then in particular for remote or online summer instruction. And so I wanted to just kind of show you what this can look like. And I'm going to show you in terms of how I've built it into my own B courses site. But I want to keep in mind that even if you're not super comfortable using B courses or building out your own site in this way, there are other ways of conveying to students what the pattern of the week is going to look like, why it's there, why it's going to repeat. Okay, so even though I'm using B courses in this case, don't feel like this is the only way to relay the kind of pattern that I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do now is just move from my dashboard, okay, into, this was actually a spring course, but as I'm saying, this is an approach that I'm recommending in particular for summer courses. You'll see here that this module or week menu, right, that's here running across the top of the welcome page, and it actually runs across the top of every page of my B courses site. This is how my students are able to access the overview for each and every week, but it also helps me to emphasize the pattern and make it very easily accessible to them. So I'm just going to give you a quick look at module week 4. I will have to stop myself from telling you about my archival photographs or about the really awesome novel that we read this week, etc. But rather, I'm just going to scroll through this very, very slowly, hopefully not too fast. I don't want to make anyone dizzy, but I want to emphasize this week's schedule. So in every single one of my module pages, I have a little schedule that looks exactly like this, and it functions to emphasize the pattern that we're going to be working with as a class. So if you scroll further down, then you can, of course, see how these different assignments or these different elements in the pattern are extended. So Monday materials, for example, it's clear if you look at the calendar exactly when these things are due. Then if you scroll further down, you get a long description. This was a particularly intense Monday, as you can see, but you have kind of there a list of all of the different handouts, videos, synchronous and asynchronous components that I was asking students to complete for that particular Monday. Then I'm going to go back to the calendar, right? I really feature my office hours here. I try to include the link so that students don't have to dig around if they want to talk to me. It's there. They can click it, they can sign up, or they can, of course, email me if they have any trouble. Then when it comes to the synchronous components, I also have the link for all of our Zoom meetings. I use Google Doc homepages for all of our synchronous meetings so that we have a place to collaborate. I have a place to also post different activity prompts, questions that I'd like to use to guide our discussion for that day, etc. But as you can see, everything is here. So in the case of this particular pattern, students had an asynchronous Monday. So everything from Monday was an asynchronous, which meant that they did it on their own time. Then I've got virtual office hours noted here on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Wednesday materials due, those were things that I was asking students to do before our synchronous class. Zoom meeting homepage, it's all linked here. And then we also had a weekly writing practice assignment each Friday. And this was for a freshman writing seminar, but I think you can get the idea, right, of how helpful it can be, no matter whether you're dealing with different sorts of quizzes, different sorts of readings. I know many instructors are also exploring the possibilities of collaborative annotation software. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about my experience with that after today's segment, but Perusal, Hypothesis, these are basically programs where you can upload your readings and have students either in groups or all together as a class respond to and annotate, put questions, have hopefully, important and meaningful conversations about the readings that you're assigning. And those are also the kinds of assignments that you can build in to this kind of schedule. All right, I'm going to go back to our Google presentation. We can go ahead and move on.
That was absolutely amazing. That was so incredibly thorough. It's a pleasure to actually see your course pages for the first time. I think one thing that I would like to touch on in regards to B courses, Karina, and in particular in regards to your course pages, is I'm thinking back to the first time that we do some of these courses. And I know your experience was probably similar. I'm the kind of person that when I was first putting together my summer syllabus, I planned everything to a T, down to every minute of every, 3-hour lecture. And, trying to make sure, because when you're looking at these big chunks of time, and now we can be a little bit more experimental, right, with how we think about each part of the day. This online format gives us some more flexibility. But when I was putting these together for the first time, I was trying to account for everything and trying to make sure there wasn't a single idle minute of the week and that we were filling so much of our time. And while that was a good exercise, I also just want to remind everybody, please build some flexibility into your schedules, build flexibility into your syllabi. Karina and I have been doing this course for so long that we sort of know the nuances and know what works and know what doesn't work. But for the first timers, build some flexibility out there and build some time to your syllabus that may fill up or may not fill up. And also, given that this is your first time out, especially now that we're all using B courses is not just part of the course. For many of us, it is the course now. Find a format that's comfortable for you. Find a way of using B courses that is comfortable for you. And some people, and I'm one of them, like to really fill up B courses pages to make sure that all these dots are, to make sure all the little sort of nooks and crannies are covered. But that doesn't mean everyone's like that. And that doesn't mean you have to do that. And I think what's important is to give some things a try your first time out and to see what works and to see what doesn't work. One of the ways of being a good instructor is being comfortable with how you approach your content, being comfortable with how you approach your material. And I think that certainly takes time, but I just want to encourage everyone that when you're sitting down, looking at your summer syllabi, planning out each day and planning out what that's going to look like, build in some flexibility, because there's also going to be, the unknown. There's going to be things that happen that you need to react to in those particular moments. There's going to be distractions, which where you need to maybe deviate from your syllabus a little bit. And so I just want to encourage everyone that accounting for those times is okay. And I think it's a good thing to account for the possibility of the unknown.
John, could I just add something really quickly there?
You bet, go for it.
I would just also recommend that in week 1 or 2, especially if you are a new instructor, but even if you're someone who has taught 15 times over the summer, I think it is also important to build that flexibility in order to be able to listen to students.
Yeah, exactly.
So although, of course, we don't want to be making up our class as we go along, right? We come into the summer with a sense of, what it is that we're asking students to do, what kinds of skills we're asking them to practice, what kinds of questions we're asking them to grapple with. At the same time, it can be very, very important as early as the end of week 1 to have students fill out an anonymous Google form and just check in with them about, how the course feels and how the pacing is working, and are the assignments, clearly laid out for them, and do they feel like their learning is being supported. This can be very difficult in a large class. Some of the classes that I teach are over 100 students. And of course, when you get feedback from 115 people, it's virtually impossible to, address every single person's concern. However, it's important to ask. I think it's important to listen, and it's important to do what we can, and build some of that flexibility in so that we can respond to student feedback.
I think we can move to question 3, Karina. One of the real hallmarks of our campus, and I'm not just saying this because Victoria's in the room, but I'm saying this because I truly believe it, is the American cultures component. And just as Victoria mentioned when we started, whether you're teaching an AC course or not, AC is providing one of these frameworks for which we approach these tough issues in the classroom. And for this last question, and this always happens where we get really kind of pushed for time, but we wanted to allocate some time for this. And that is this issue of sort of integrating AC curriculum and AC content into our courses. And once again, whether you're doing an ACE course or not, it's a broader discussion to be had. The one thing I can say unequivocally is that in my experience is a little bit biased. I teach in ethnic studies. And so my students, the students who self-select courses in Native American studies, in ethnic studies, in Asian American studies, African American studies, Chicano studies, they're often students who do already have an interest in questions about race and ethnicity and inequality and structural racism. And so my experience is a little bit biased because I know those students are coming into these particular courses, but we have a broader range of AC courses in different departments. One of the things I can say in reflecting on, the last few years of doing these courses, and it's especially been the case in the last year, is that, believe it or not, students are ready to talk about these issues. And I didn't always say that. I didn't always feel that, but I think especially as students are looking at their phones and paying attention to the world around them and talking to friends and staying connected with the world, they want to engage in these conversations. They're interested in it. They care about it. And students are ready to roll when given the opportunity to talk about these questions of race and ethnicity. One of the things I've noticed at that same time that I've seen students really step up and want this material infused into our courses, the pushback I've seen is largely from instructors. And it's from instructors who have been doing what they do for a very long time and who are nervous about the possibility of introducing these tougher topics into the conversation. And I say that because since many of you are getting started teaching, thinking about ways to infuse questions of equity and anti-racism into your courses, please realize it's up to you to what level you want to infuse these into your courses and to what extent that you do so. I think students are looking for answers. They have big questions and they want ways to contextualize them. They want ways to think about them. They want ways to complicate them. And if you offer those opportunities, more often than not, students will react to it, and students will know how to take it somewhere. And oftentimes it's up to the teachers to be flexible with how they want to introduce this content into their classrooms. And in part, I think there's a hesitancy because a lot of us, don't have the answers, or we have the same questions the students have. We have the same issues. We're concerned about the same things that our students are concerned with. And oftentimes we have to be vulnerable a little bit. We have to be a little bit vulnerable. We have to be a little bit self-reflective to allow ourselves in our classes to talk about these particular issues. But in my experience, and in the last couple of years in particular, students are ready to talk about it. Students are ready to address these issues in the classroom. And it's kind of requires our own flexibility and our own willingness to be uncomfortable with where it might go, to be successful and to really be reflective in how we can effectively discuss these issues in a classroom setting. Karina, I don't know if you had a similar experience. I mean, you're coming from a comp lit background, so maybe it's a different set of students that you're dealing with.
I mean, for me, it is a different set of students. I get a lot more surprised students, I think, when we talk about questions of race and systemic inequalities in my class, particularly the AC classes, to the extent that we do. But just to echo what John was saying, I think not only do students want to talk about these topics, but they actually very much need to. And they're asking for that as well. So even though it can be difficult for us as instructors, particularly while teaching remotely through Zoom, right, through online means, it can be very difficult to cultivate the kind of community, right, a sense of openness, a sense of vulnerability that is required to address these topics. I would just say that I think it's worth a try. I think it's worth a try. And I also think that students right now in particular really need those spaces, and they're looking to us to create them. So I would encourage you to do what you can, and then just also be open with students about the ways in which you also carry these questions within yourself, and you're also grappling with them, and yet, valuing their responses, their opinions, and also their need to get a read on their world, and also talk about it and work through it in a collaborative community space.
One of the reasons why I mentioned flexibility in the previous segment was that seems to be one of the hallmarks of my approach to the classroom over the last several years. Over the last several years, there's been so many of these sort of culturally defining moments that have been very important teaching moments. And I started to realize that when these events were happening, students were paying attention to them. Students were showing up to class with questions. Students were showing up to class wanting to talk about these issues. And it became more and more difficult for me to justify, no, we're just going to stick to the syllabus. No, we're just going to stick with the readings that were on the schedule for today. I, in good conscience, couldn't proceed on those grounds anymore. And it seemed quite consistently that students were, bringing into class, showing up to class with issues that were going on and things they wanted to talk about and issues they wanted to address. And we had to build into the courses, we had to build into kind of how we proceeded the space for allow those conversations to be taking place. You can always steer it back into the content. You can always steer it back into the material if you want to do so. But I think one thing more than any other is that students want a space to be heard, and that students want a space where their voices can be listened to. And if you allow students the opportunity in a classroom setting to voice those opinions and to do it constructively, I think it can be a valuable teaching tool. I think it can present a valuable opportunity to give students the opportunity to talk about things that they find important, that they see in some way connects to the material. And I think going back to that issue of flexibility is knowing that these issues might come up, and they've come up so frequently, and thinking about how in a classroom setting and how with someone who's trying to abide by a syllabus and a schedule and assignments, how you might react to students when some of these really important issues do arise.
Thank you so much. We've run out of time. That's incredible to me. I'm so sorry that we've run out of time. John and Karina, do you want to have any last words for the group?
I'll say one thing, and I know it's corny, and I know this goes back to teaching 101, and I know it goes back to basic things you can do, but I think it means more now than it did before. And remember your students' names. Remember something interesting about them. Remember where they're from. And in after a few weeks goes by, talk to them about that thing they mentioned. Say something, ask them about their hometown. And I do this as a way to just to let them know that someone's listening to them, and that when you ask them questions, you're paying attention to their answers. Students who don't know if they fit, who don't know if they belong, who don't know if they're being listened to. And all it takes is just your attention to just to know that you're checking in on them, to know that they have a name, and to know that you care about the things they might have to say. And it doesn't need to be about the class. It doesn't need to be about the content. It can be just something about them. And that can go a long way.
Such good advice, John. Thank you. Karina, any last words?
Mostly just, thank you. And also remember to care for yourselves. We've, just spent lots of time talking about, how do we best foster student learning, and, how do we design courses, and how do we think about student learning outcomes. And I think it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, about how, in order to encourage my students to take care of themselves and keep well in a moment like like this, then I also think it's important that I'm open with them about my own need to take care. I don't know about all of you, but I've been parenting 24/7. I've been, a TA for 5th grade virtual school, all kinds of, new working from home. There will always be a loud car or a gardener or a something, right? A loud conversation happening out. And so I think we've really needed to think about how to show our students understanding, but we also need to think about how to show ourselves understanding at this moment and do the best we can.
I can't think of a better note to end on, a kind of politics of care that we can share with each other. So thank you so much for that. Relationships can very much outlast an event. And to the question by Erin about how do we connect with others who may have experience with facilitating some of these very difficult dialogues, Erin, please reach out and we can put you in touch with people, maybe John or Karina, or maybe myself or other people. And I just want to thank everybody for being here. And good luck with the summer. You are not alone. Reach out to us if you need some support and want to follow up. So I think that's the official kind of goodbye, farewell, but only for now. And hopefully we'll all be in touch soon. We'll send a follow-up message at all the links that have been mentioned in the workshop today. So good luck, and it'll be fine. We'll be fine. John and Karina, thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you so much.